Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're stripping away centuries of folklore to uncover the historically accurate, absolutely incredible story of Joan of Arc. Relying strictly on the historical source material, we're going to dig into exactly who she was and what she actually accomplished during her remarkably short life. So let's just dive right into our central question here. How exactly did an illiterate teenage peasant manage to totally alter the trajectory of the Hundred Years' War? I mean, it sounds like something straight out of a fantasy novel, right? But it is literally recorded history. Let's find out how she did it.
All right, Section 1, a divided France.
To really understand Joan's meteoric rise, you've got to understand the absolutely dire political landscape she was born into. It was essentially a war-torn, divided mess. On one side, you have the Armagnacs. They're fighting for the legitimate French heir, Dauphin Charles VII. And on the other side, the Burgundians. And they took a wildly different approach by actively allying with the invading English forces. With Paris and most of the north completely under English control, the Armagnac cause was deeply demoralized. It was basically hanging by a thread. Which brings us to Section 2, Voices and Visions. Out of all this intense geopolitical chaos, we see our first massive shift. In the tiny village of Domremy, an illiterate 13-year-old girl named Joan started experiencing these really profound visions. We're talking Saints Michael, Margaret, and Catherine actively commanding her to expel the English and bring the Dauphin to Reims to be crowned. And this wasn't just some passing daydream, It was a divine calling she literally swore her entire life to. And here's where it gets wild. She didn't just stay home and pray. She took massive, highly dangerous steps to offer her military assistance. First, she petitions the local garrison commander. It takes her 3 tries, by the way, to finally get his support. Then, she literally travels through hostile enemy territory disguised in men's clothing just to stay safe. And finally, in early 1429, she makes it to the royal court at Chinon and privately convinces Charles VII that she is the real deal. But her sheer strategic brilliance really shines in her public branding. She starts calling herself La Pucelle, or the Maiden. Now, why does that matter? Well, there was this hugely popular countryside prophecy floating around that an armed virgin would save France. By explicitly claiming that exact title, she brilliantly tapped right into that prophecy. She turned a boring dynastic squabble into a holy war and instantly fired up a deeply demoralized Armagnac army. Moving right along to Section 3, the Savior of Orléans. Now armed with a custom suit of plate armor, and the Dauphin's blessing, of course, Joan steps directly onto the battlefield, and her momentum here is just breathless. In late April 1429, she arrives at Orleans. By early May, she lifts a completely hopeless siege, even after taking an arrow to the neck, mind you. By June, she's decimating the English at Patay. And in July, she achieves her ultimate goal, marching into Reims to watch Charles VII officially get crowned. Literally, in just a few short months, a teenager completely flipped the war. But the story takes a dark turn in Section 4, Capture and Betrayal. As is so often the case with these hero journeys, the momentum shifts really tragically from triumph straight to sudden betrayal. See, with the king now officially crowned, he suddenly favored diplomacy over Joan's highly aggressive military tactics. So, politically isolated and fighting without explicit royal permission, Joan leads a weekend volunteer force to Compiègne in May 1430, where she is promptly captured by Burgundian troops. To put the sheer scale of the geopolitics into perspective, just think about this ransom amount, 10,000 livres tournois. That is a staggering sum. The English literally bought Joan from their Burgundian allies for a fortune just to eliminate their biggest military threat. And honestly, the darkest part of this whole ordeal, there is absolutely zero historical evidence that King Charles VII lifted a single finger to save her. Let's look at what happened next in Section 5, the rigged trial. So the English finally have her, but here's the catch. They couldn't just execute her as a standard prisoner of war. They needed a legally binding, religiously disguised political hit job. They slapped her with charges like acting on demonic visions, refusing church authority, and, crucially, wearing men's clothes. The whole goal here was to legally prove she was a heretic, because if she's a heretic, then the divine legitimacy of Charles VII's shiny new crown is completely invalidated. But Joan was incredibly formidable. Lacking any legal counsel, she goes toe-to-toe with these seasoned theologians who are actively trying to trap her. At one point, they ask if she knew she was in God's grace. Now, this is a lethal trap. Saying yes is heresy, saying no is an admission of guilt. But she gives this absolutely brilliant, razor-sharp answer. If I am not in God's grace, may God put me there. And if I am, may God so keep me. The trial notaries literally wrote down that her interrogators were stunned. Just a masterclass under pressure. So, unable to outsmart her on theology, the inquisitors pivot and weaponize her clothing against her. They heavily fixate on her male attire, but they intentionally ignore the very grim reality of why she was wearing it. Shackled in a secular prison and guarded day and night by hostile male soldiers, tying her men's clothes tightly together was a vital deterrent against assault. It was purely a practical necessity to protect her own physical safety and modesty. Which brings us to a really heartbreaking reality. After being terrified into signing an abjuration, she's sent back to her cell. Naturally, she soon resumes wearing men's clothes. Again, almost certainly to protect herself from the guards. The court pounces on this, maliciously framing it as a relapse into heresy. She was officially condemned and burned at the stake in Rouen at the unbelievably shocking age of just 19 years old. But the story doesn't end there. Section 6, Saint and Symbol. Because the ashes in Rouen were far from the end of her story. See, having his crown directly tied to a condemned heretic was a massive political liability for King Charles. So, in 1450, an inquest is opened. By 1456, this rehabilitation trial systematically exposed all the deceit and corruption of her original trial, completely clearing her name. And it paved this really long road to her official canonization as a Catholic saint, which finally happened centuries later in 1920. And what's absolutely fascinating about her posthumous legacy is just how universally it's been claimed. I mean, because her story is so fundamentally human, she's achieved this incredible historical immortality. She's been held up as a model of autonomy by early feminists, celebrated as the ultimate patriot by French nationalists, and even served as a symbol of unwavering courage for World War II resistance fighters. She really became everything to everyone. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on. When you look at her story, is Joan's true miracle those divine visions? Or is it the unbreakable human conviction of a teenage girl standing up against an entire empire? Even if you strip away all the centuries of mythology, isn't the absolute, unyielding will of this young woman enough to be considered a miracle in its own right? Thanks for exploring this history with me today, and stay curious.